What if one of the greatest mysteries of the ancient world was hiding on a tiny island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean? An island so remote that, for centuries, the nearest mainland was thousands of miles away. No roads connected it to the outside world. No modern ships carried its first settlers. No aircraft guided them across the endless blue horizon. And yet, somehow ancient people found it. They crossed an ocean so vast that, from the surface, there was almost nothing to see. No towering mountains on the horizon. No obvious landmark. Just waves, wind, stars, and an immense sky stretching in every direction. Then they reached land. A volcanic island rose from the Pacific. And generations later, something extraordinary began to appear across its landscape. Stone giants, hundreds of them, some standing several meters tall, some weighing dozens of tons. Their enormous faces staring silently across the island. Today we call them the Moai. But the Moai are only the beginning of the mystery. Who were the people who built them? Why would an isolated society invest so much time and energy into carving enormous human figures from volcanic rock? And perhaps the most impossible question of all, how did they move them? Imagine standing beside a stone figure weighing many tons. There are no engines, no cranes, no trucks, no steel machinery. Only human beings, ropes, stone tools, wood, and the knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Yet somehow, these enormous statues traveled across the island. Some researchers believe they were dragged. Others have proposed wooden sledges or systems of logs. And then there is the most fascinating possibility of all. What if the Moai were not dragged? What if they were made to walk? But the mystery becomes even stranger when we reach the ancient quarry of Rano Raraku. There, hundreds of statues remain. Some were completed, some were abandoned, and some are still attached to the volcanic mountain from which they were being carved. It is almost as if the workers simply stopped one day and never returned. For a long time, the story of Easter Island was presented as a warning. A civilization supposedly destroyed its own environment, cut down its forests, exhausted its resources, and collapsed. But modern archaeological research has revealed a much more complicated story. The people of Rapa Nui did not simply disappear. Their culture changed, their beliefs changed, their environment changed, and eventually, they faced forces from the outside world that would transform the island forever. There are also mysteries that remain unresolved. A strange system of symbols known as Rongorongo has never been fully deciphered. A powerful religious tradition known as the Birdman cult emerged after the age of the Great Moai. And there is evidence suggesting that Polynesians may have reached South America long before European explorers crossed the Pacific. Then, of course, there are the theories that go even further. Some have claimed that the Moai were too enormous, too sophisticated, or too mysterious to have been created by ordinary human beings. Some have even suggested ancient visitors from beyond Earth. But perhaps we do not need aliens to explain Easter Island. Perhaps the truth is far more remarkable, because the people who created these monuments were human. They were skilled navigators. They were farmers. They were craftsmen. They were parents, warriors, leaders, and storytellers. They inherited knowledge from generations before them and transformed a tiny volcanic island into one of the most extraordinary cultural landscapes on Earth. And their achievements are still standing. The statues survived. The roads survived. The quarry survived. The ceremonial platforms survived. But the world that created them is gone. Today, all we have are the stones, the landscape, the archaeological evidence, and the questions. So in this journey, we are going to travel deep into the mystery of Easter Island. We will follow the ancient Polynesian navigators who first reached this remote island. We will enter the quarry where the stone giants were born. We will uncover the theories behind their impossible transportation. We will investigate the story of deforestation, ecological collapse, and the mysterious transformation of Rapa Nui society. And finally, we will confront the questions that archaeology still cannot completely answer. Because after centuries of investigation, one question continues to echo across this lonely island. How did a small human society, living on one of the most isolated pieces of land on Earth, create something so enormous that the entire world is still trying to understand it? The answer begins here, on a volcanic island surrounded by nothing but the Pacific Ocean. An island known today as Easter Island. But to the people who called it home, it was Rapa Nui, and this is the mystery of the stone giants. To understand the mystery of Easter Island, we have to go back before the Moai, before the great stone platforms, before the abandoned quarry, and before the stories of collapse. We have to go back to a time when Rapa Nui was nothing more than a distant volcanic island surrounded by an ocean that seemed almost endless. Today, reaching Easter Island is a journey that can be planned with maps, aircraft, GPS, and modern navigation systems. But imagine trying to reach the same island more than 1,000 years ago. You are standing on a wooden canoe somewhere in the middle of the Pacific. There is no satellite image showing your location. There is no compass telling you exactly where you are. There is no radio. There is no engine. Behind you is the land you came from. In front of you is an ocean stretching farther than the human eye can see. And somewhere beyond that horizon, there is an island so small that missing it could mean sailing past it without ever knowing it existed. Yet somehow, Polynesian navigators found Rapa Nui. They did not stumble upon it by pure luck. The settlement of the island was part of a much larger story of exploration across the Pacific, one of the greatest episodes of human navigation in history. For centuries, Polynesian peoples traveled enormous distances between islands scattered across a vast ocean. They developed sophisticated ways of reading the natural world. They observed the positions of stars, the movement of the sun, the direction of ocean swells, changes in wind, cloud formations, birds, marine life, and other environmental signals. To modernize, an open ocean can look almost completely empty. To an experienced navigator, it could contain information. A particular pattern of waves could suggest the presence of a distant island. Birds flying in a certain direction could provide clues about land. Clouds might behave differently above islands because of rising terrain and moisture. The night sky provided a map that moved with the seasons. Knowledge of these patterns was not necessarily written on paper. It was remembered, practiced, taught, and passed from one generation to another. This was not primitive navigation. It was a highly developed system of environmental observation adapted to one of the most challenging environments on Earth. And somewhere during the first millennium of the Common Era, Polynesian voyagers reached Rapa Nui. The exact date of initial settlement remains a subject of archaeological research, and estimates have changed as new evidence has emerged. But what is clear is that the island was settled by people whose ancestors belonged to the wider Polynesian world. They arrived carrying the knowledge, plants, animals, tools, traditions, and social structures that would allow a community to survive far from the islands they had known before. Imagine their first approach. After days or perhaps weeks at sea, the horizon begins to change. A dark shape rises above the ocean. At first it might appear to be a cloud. Then the shape becomes more distinct. Volcanic land emerges from the Pacific. Rapa Nui is not a tropical paradise covered in endless jungle. It is a rugged volcanic island formed by ancient eruptions, with rolling grasslands, volcanic craters, rocky coastlines, and steep cliffs in places. But for people who had spent days surrounded by nothing but ocean, seeing land would have been an extraordinary moment. They had found the island, and now they had to survive on it. The first settlers would have encountered an environment very different from the landscape we see today. Rapa Nui once supported a more extensive palm forest, although the exact nature, density, and timing of forest change remain subjects of archaeological and ecological research. The island also contained freshwater sources, fertile areas, seabirds, marine resources, and soils that could support agriculture. The settlers brought crops such as sweet potato and other Polynesian plants, as well as domesticated animals. Among them were chickens and, eventually, the Polynesian rat, which traveled widely with Polynesian voyagers. The first generations had to learn the island itself. Where was the best soil? Where could fresh water be found? Which plants could grow reliably? Which coastal areas offered fish and shellfish? Where could houses be built safely? Which volcanic slopes could provide stone? These questions were not merely practical. They were the foundation of a new society. Over generations, small settlements became communities. Families established relationships with particular areas of land. Social structures developed. Religious traditions evolved. Knowledge about farming and fishing was refined. The island became more than a place where people had arrived. It became home. And then something happened that would transform Rapa Nui forever. The descendants of those first settlers began creating monumental architecture. They built ceremonial platforms. They developed distinctive stoneworking traditions. And eventually, they began carving enormous human figures from the volcanic rock of the island. At first, it may have been a relatively modest tradition. But over generations, the figures became larger, more ambitious, and more numerous. The landscape itself began to change. Stone monuments appeared along the coast and near communities. Roads connected different parts of the island. The quarry at Rano Raraku became the center of a remarkable industry of monumental stone carving. And the Moai became symbols of identity, ancestry, authority, and spiritual power. But before the first giant face emerged from the volcanic stone, the people of Rapa Nui had already accomplished something extraordinary. They had found an island that was extraordinarily difficult to find. They had crossed one of the world's largest oceans using technologies that depended not on engines or instruments, but on knowledge of nature. Their achievement is easy to underestimate because modern navigation makes ocean travel seem simple. We can look at a digital map and instantly see where Easter Island is. We can zoom in on the island from space. We can calculate distances with a computer. But ancient navigators did not have that luxury. For them, the Pacific was not a blank space. It was a living environment filled with signs that had to be interpreted correctly. A mistake could be fatal. A storm could destroy a canoe. A navigational error could carry a crew far from its destination. Food and fresh water were limited, and the farther they traveled, the greater the risk. Yet the Polynesian expansion across the Pacific demonstrates that these societies possessed extraordinary maritime capabilities. Rapa Nui was one of the most isolated destinations in that enormous network of islands. Its nearest inhabited Polynesian neighbors were extremely far away, which made the island's settlement a remarkable feat of exploration. Once established, the Rapa Nui people developed a culture that was increasingly distinct from other Polynesian societies. Isolation does not always destroy cultural creativity. Sometimes it intensifies it. Without constant contact with neighboring islands, traditions can evolve in unique directions. Local resources become more important. Social institutions adapt to the environment. Religious practices take on new forms. Art develops its own visual language. And on Rapa Nui, that isolation eventually produced one of the most recognizable archaeological landscapes on Earth. But there is an important detail we must not forget. The people who arrived here did not know that they were creating a civilization that would one day become the subject of documentaries, archaeological expeditions, scientific debates, and endless speculation. They were simply trying to live. They were raising children, growing food, building homes, fishing, honoring their ancestors, protecting their communities, and remembering where they came from. The first settlers could never have imagined that centuries later, people would stand on the same volcanic ground and ask how their descendants had achieved so much with seemingly limited resources. They could not have known that their stone monuments would survive long after their society changed. And they certainly could not have known that the greatest mystery of their civilization was still waiting to be carved. Because eventually, the relationship between the people of Rapa Nui and their ancestors became visible in stone. The dead could no longer speak, but their memory could be represented. Important ancestors could be honored through monuments. Communities could display their identity through architecture. And the island's volcanic rock provided the raw material. At Rano Raraku, the mountain itself became a canvas. Stoneworkers learned how to shape the volcanic tuff into human forms. They began with the rock.
It is beautiful,
then came the outline,
so
the face, the shoulders, the arms, the hands. Slowly, a human figure emerged from the mountain. But these were not ordinary human figures. They were enormous. And as generations passed, the ambition grew. The people of Rapa Nui were entering a period of monumental construction unlike anything seen before on the island. Soon, hundreds of stone figures would exist across the landscape. Some would be transported many miles from the quarry. Some would be raised upon enormous ceremonial platforms. Some would receive massive red stone ornaments on their heads. And some would never leave the mountain at all. Their unfinished bodies would remain frozen in the volcanic slopes for centuries. But why? Why would an isolated island society devote so much labor to creating giants of stone? What did these figures mean to the people who carved them? And how did a community without modern machinery transform a volcanic mountain into hundreds of enormous human faces? To answer those questions, we have to leave the ocean behind and enter the world of the Moai. Because the arrival of the first settlers explains how Rapa Nui became a home. But the Moai reveal what that home eventually became. For generations, the people of Rapa Nui lived on a small volcanic island in the middle of the Pacific. They had learned how to survive there, how to grow food, navigate the surrounding waters, and build communities. But eventually, something extraordinary began to transform the landscape. Across the island, enormous human figures began to rise from the stone. They were not castles. They were not walls. They were not monuments to a single king whose name would be remembered in written history. They were the Moai, and they would become one of the most recognizable archaeological mysteries on Earth. At first glance, a Moai appears surprisingly simple. A massive head, a long nose, heavy brows, large ears, narrow lips, long arms pressed against the sides of the body. The figures stand upright with an almost unnatural stillness, their expressions calm and severe. But behind that simple appearance lies an extraordinary amount of work. These were not stones that happened to resemble human beings. They were deliberately designed, carefully shaped, and carved according to a distinctive artistic tradition that developed on Rapa Nui over generations. Archaeologists have documented nearly 1,000 Moai across the island, including completed figures, partially completed statues, and those still associated with the quarry at Rano Raraku. They vary greatly in size. Some are relatively small, while others are enormous. Many completed statues are several meters tall, and some weigh dozens of tons. The scale is difficult to understand until you imagine standing directly beside one. A human being becomes tiny in comparison. The face alone can be taller than a person. The body stretches upward like a single enormous column of volcanic stone. And yet, the most important question is not simply how big the Moai were. It is why they were created. For many years, outsiders described them as mysterious statues with unknown purposes. But archaeological and ethnographic evidence points toward a much more meaningful interpretation. The Moai were likely connected to ancestors and ancestral power. They appear to have been part of a religious and social system in which important people from previous generations remained connected to the living community. In many human societies, death does not necessarily mean complete disappearance. A person's name can survive. Their descendants can inherit their status. Their stories can become part of the identity of a family. Their achievements can be remembered long after their physical body is gone. On Rapa Nui, the Moai may have provided a monumental physical representation of that ancestral presence. They transformed memory into stone. A human life is temporary. A stone monument can remain for centuries. This may explain why many Moai were placed on ceremonial platforms known as ahu. These structures were important elements of Rapa Nui's ritual and social landscape. The Moai were not simply scattered randomly around the island. Their locations were connected to particular communities, territories, and ceremonial spaces. In many cases, the statues faced inland, toward the communities associated with them, rather than outward toward the endless Pacific. That orientation makes sense if the figures were understood as ancestral guardians or representatives. They were not necessarily looking toward the distant world beyond the island. They were looking toward the people. Imagine living in a community where an enormous ancestral figure stood permanently above the landscape. Every day, the people could see it. Every generation would grow up beneath it. Children would become adults while the stone ancestor remained unchanged. People would die and new generations would replace them, but the Moai would continue to stand. The monument could therefore become a physical symbol of continuity. The ancestors were not simply part of the past. They remained present in the landscape, but creating these figures required an extraordinary amount of labor. And this is where the story becomes an engineering mystery. Most Moai were carved from volcanic tuff at Rano Raraku, an ancient volcanic crater on the eastern side of the island. The material is relatively soft compared with harder volcanic rock, making it suitable for carving with stone tools. The ancient craftsmen could work directly into the mountainside, gradually removing material until the shape of a human figure emerged. But they did not simply carve a block and then transport it. In many cases, the statue was carved while it remained attached to the bedrock. The workers began by defining the front of the figure. The face was shaped. The torso was outlined. The arms and hands were carved. The surface was refined. Eventually, the statue would be separated from the mountain and prepared for movement. This process created something extraordinary at Rano Raraku. The quarry became a landscape filled with statues at different stages of construction. Some appear almost complete. Others are clearly unfinished. Some lie on the slopes. Others stand partially embedded in the volcanic rock. Some remain attached to the mountain itself. Walking through the quarry today can feel like entering an ancient workshop where the workers simply disappeared in the middle of the day. Imagine what the site must have looked like when it was active. The slopes would have been filled with craftsmen. Stone tools would strike volcanic rock again and again. Dust would cover the ground. Groups of workers would move materials. Supervisors or community leaders may have coordinated the work. The sound of carving could have continued for hours. A statue that would eventually dominate a ceremonial platform began as nothing more than a rough shape inside the mountain. Slowly, the human form appeared. First the outline, then the face, then the body, then the final details. It was an enormous investment of time and labor. And that investment tells us something important about Rapa Nui society. The Moai could not have been created by one individual working alone. Monumental construction requires organization. People have to be fed. Tools have to be produced. Materials have to be transported. Workers have to be coordinated. Communities have to agree that the project is worth the effort. This means the Moai are evidence not only of artistic skill but of social organization. A society capable of producing hundreds of massive monuments must have possessed systems for mobilizing labor and resources. The statues may therefore tell us something about power. A chief or important lineage capable of commissioning a large Moai could demonstrate influence through monumental construction. Communities may have competed with one another to build impressive monuments. The size and quality of a statue could have reflected the status of the ancestor or the community associated with it. We should be careful not to reduce the entire Moai tradition to simple competition. Religion, ancestry, identity, and social status were likely interconnected. But the ability to organize large projects was undoubtedly important. And then there is the question of scale. Why did some statues become so large? Was there a point at which a monument became more powerful because it was physically larger? Did increasingly ambitious projects reflect competition between communities? Or were craftsmen experimenting with what they could achieve? We may never know exactly why the statues grew in size over time, but the evidence suggests that monumental construction was not static. It evolved. The builders experimented. Their artistic traditions changed. Their ambitions changed. And eventually, they produced some truly enormous figures. One of the most remarkable examples is an unfinished Moai still embedded in the quarry. Had it been completed, it would have been vastly larger than most statues that were actually transported. It is a haunting sight because it captures a moment that never reached its conclusion. The face had been carved. The body was being developed. But the statue remained trapped in the mountain. Why? Was it abandoned because the builders encountered a structural problem? Did the stone crack? Did the project simply become too ambitious? Did the community that commissioned it lose the resources or political power necessary to complete it? Or did the cultural meaning of Moai construction begin to change? There is no single answer that archaeologists can point to with absolute certainty. What we can say is that Rano Raraku preserves evidence of a changing tradition. The unfinished statues are not simply failed projects. They are snapshots of the process. They show us how the Moai were made and reveal the enormous scale of the undertaking. But there is another mystery hidden inside these statues. What we see today is not always what the ancient people would have seen. Many Moai were buried or partially covered over time by soil and erosion. For decades, photographs of Easter Island circulated showing enormous stone heads emerging from the ground. This created a widespread misconception that the Moai were simply giant heads. Archaeological excavation later revealed that many of these statues possess elongated bodies extending beneath the surface. Their arms, hands, torsos, and other features had simply been covered by centuries of accumulated sediment. The discovery changed how the public imagined the monuments. The Moai were not giant heads. They were full human figures, deliberately designed with bodies and proportions that gave them a distinctive monumental appearance. And once again, the landscape itself had become part of the mystery. Time had hidden part of the original monuments. The island that modern visitors see is not exactly the island the ancient builders knew. Soil accumulated, vegetation changed, erosion reshaped the ground. The environment transformed around the statues while the stone figures remained. But perhaps the most extraordinary part of the story is that carving the Moai was only the beginning. Once a statue had been separated from the quarry, the builders still had to transport it. Some ceremonial platforms were located far from Rano Raraku. A statue weighing many tons had to leave the mountain, cross uneven terrain, and somehow reach its final destination. Then it had to be raised onto an ahu. And all of this happened without modern machinery. No cranes, no engines, no trucks, no steel cables. Only human strength, ropes, stone tools, natural materials, and engineering knowledge. The transportation problem becomes even more difficult when you consider the number of statues involved. This was not a single extraordinary feat performed once. It happened repeatedly over generations. The Rapa Nui people had developed some kind of system that allowed them to move enormous stone figures across their island. And the physical evidence has left behind clues about how they may have done it. Ancient roads connect the quarry region with other parts of the island. Some statues were abandoned along transportation routes. Others fell during their journeys. These remains provide archaeologists with a record of movement. They allow researchers to reconstruct possible transportation methods and test them experimentally. One possibility is that the Moai were dragged using ropes and wooden structures. Another involves sledges or logs. But another theory is even more surprising. Researchers have demonstrated that a carefully shaped Moai replica can be moved upright using ropes and coordinated rocking motions. Instead of dragging the statue, teams pull from different directions, causing the figure to tilt from side to side and gradually advance. To an observer, the statue appears to walk. It sounds impossible until you see the physics in action. And if the ancient Rapa Nui used a similar technique, it would completely change the way we imagine the transportation of the Moai. They may not have needed to overpower the stone. They may have learned how to cooperate with its balance. The Moai itself may have been designed in a way that made this possible. A heavy stone figure becomes easier to control when its shape, center of mass, and movement are understood. In that sense, the true technology may not have been a machine at all. It may have been knowledge. But there is still another layer to the mystery. Why would an isolated society devote generations to creating, transporting, and raising hundreds of enormous ancestral figures? Why did the tradition become so important? And why did it eventually decline? At Rano Raraku, the evidence seems to suggest that the answer cannot be reduced to one simple event. The quarry contains too many unfinished statues, too many stages of construction, too much evidence of a long and evolving tradition. Something changed. Perhaps environmental pressures played a role. Perhaps political structures shifted. Perhaps religious beliefs evolved. Perhaps the meaning of monumental construction changed over time. Or perhaps several of these factors happened together. What we know is that the Moai tradition did not continue forever. The quarry eventually became silent. The stone tools stopped striking the volcanic slopes. The workers stopped carving. The unfinished giants remained where they were. But before that silence arrived, the people of Rapa Nui had already accomplished something remarkable. They had transformed volcanic rock into human form. They had turned ancestral memory into monumental architecture. They had organized communities around projects that required extraordinary amounts of labor. And somehow they had learned to move these stone giants across the island. The Moai therefore represent far more than an archaeological puzzle. They are a record of what a human society believed was worth doing. They reveal what people were willing to sacrifice in time and effort to honor their ancestors, demonstrate identity, and shape the landscape around them. And perhaps this is why the Moai still have such power today. We stand in front of them and see stone. But the people who created them may have seen something else entirely. They may have seen their ancestors. They may have seen their history. They may have seen the presence of generations that came before them. They may have believed that the power of those ancestors continued to influence the living. And if that was the true purpose of the Moai, then their greatest achievement was not simply surviving for centuries. It was preserving a relationship between the living and the dead in a form that even time could not easily erase. But now we reach the question that has fascinated the world for generations. We know where most of the Moai were born. We know something about how they were carved. We know where many of them eventually stood. But between the quarry and the ceremonial platforms lies a missing chapter. A journey across the island that seems almost impossible. Because somehow, these enormous stone giants had to leave the mountain and travel across Rapa Nui. And the method they used may be one of the most ingenious examples of ancient engineering ever discovered. The next mystery is simple to ask, but astonishingly difficult to answer. How did the Moai move? The Moai had been carved from the volcanic slopes of Rano Raraku. Their faces had emerged from the stone. Their bodies had been shaped by generations of craftsmen. But carving a giant was only the first challenge. The real problem came next. Somehow, these enormous stone figures had to leave the quarry and travel across the island. And this is where the mystery becomes almost impossible to imagine. Picture a completed Moai standing at the foot of the volcano. It weighs several tons. It has no wheels. It has no mechanical joints. It cannot move by itself. There are no engines, no cranes, no steel cables, and no modern vehicles. Yet the statue has to travel across uneven volcanic terrain and eventually reach an ahu, where it will be raised into its final position. The question is simple. How? For decades, researchers have proposed different answers. Some theories are relatively straightforward. Others are remarkably sophisticated. And one of them suggests something that sounds almost impossible. The ancient people of Rapa Nui may have made the Moai walk. To understand the problem, we first have to imagine the physical challenge faced by the builders. A Moai is not a simple rectangular block. It is tall, narrow, and top-heavy. Its shape makes it difficult to drag or roll in the same way you might move a stone block. The face could be damaged. The body could crack. The statue could fall. If it was transported horizontally, the builders would need to protect the carved surface and control the enormous weight. If it was moved upright, they would have to maintain its balance. Either way, the transportation process required planning, coordination, and an extraordinary understanding of the physical properties of the stone. One of the earliest and most intuitive explanations is that the Moai were dragged. Hundreds of people could have attached ropes to the statue and pulled it across the ground. Perhaps wooden structures were placed beneath it to reduce friction. Perhaps the transportation routes were prepared in advance. Perhaps teams of workers pulled together while others guided the statue. The basic idea is not impossible. Ancient civilizations around the world moved enormous stones using human labor. The Egyptians transported massive blocks for temples and monuments. Builders in other ancient societies used sledges, rollers, ramps, ropes, and wooden frameworks. So there is nothing inherently impossible about Rapa Nui workers using similar principles. But there is a problem. If heavy Moai were dragged across the island using logs or wooden rollers, enormous quantities of timber might have been required. And that leads directly into one of the most controversial questions in Easter Island history. What happened to the island's forests? For a long time, the story seemed straightforward. The island was once covered in palm forest. The people wanted to move giant statues. They cut down trees to make rollers. More statues required more wood. Eventually, the forest disappeared. Without trees, the transportation system collapsed. Resources became scarce. Society entered a period of conflict and decline. It was a powerful story, and for decades it became one of the dominant explanations for the fate of Rapa Nui. But modern research has complicated that picture. The exact causes and timing of deforestation are still debated, and ecological change on the island cannot be reduced to a single cause. Human activity certainly mattered, but so did the ecology of the Polynesian rat, agricultural practices, climate variability, and other environmental factors. The disappearance of the forest was real. The simplistic idea that the islanders simply destroyed everything because they wanted to move statues is much harder to defend. So if the Moai were not necessarily transported by endless rows of wooden rollers, what else could they have done? Another possibility is that the statues were placed on wooden sledges. Instead of rolling them over individual logs, workers could have created a platform that distributed the weight and then dragged the entire structure along a prepared path. This would reduce some of the difficulties associated with rolling enormous stones, but it would still require substantial manpower, ropes, and suitable materials. Experiments with replicas have shown that large stone objects can be moved using combinations of ropes, sledges, and coordinated teams. But there is another problem. Archaeology does not give us a single surviving transportation manual. We do not have an ancient diagram showing exactly how a Moai was moved. We have roads. We have statues. We have quarry evidence. We have tools. We have environmental remains. We have oral traditions recorded much later. And from these fragments, researchers have to reconstruct what happened. This is why the transportation mystery has remained so fascinating. Different methods can sometimes produce physically possible results. The challenge is determining which method best fits the archaeological evidence. And then came an idea that seemed to change everything. What if the Moai were moved upright, not dragged, not rolled, not carried, walked? The concept sounds absurd when you first hear it. A stone statue has no legs. How can it walk? But the answer is not literal walking. It is a controlled rocking motion. Imagine a tall stone figure standing upright. Attach ropes to different points around it. A group of workers pulls from one side, causing the statue to tilt slightly. Another group pulls from the opposite side. The statue rocks back. Then the first group pulls again. Right, left, right, left. With every controlled movement, the statue advances a little farther. The process creates a strange visual effect. From a distance, the Moai appears to be walking down the road. Researchers have demonstrated versions of this technique using replicas, showing that coordinated teams can move a large upright statue through a rocking motion. The idea is particularly intriguing because the shape of the Moai may actually help the process. The figures are tall and somewhat top-heavy. Their bases can be designed to allow controlled movement. Their center of mass can work with gravity rather than against it. Instead of attempting to overcome the entire weight of the statue at once, the workers only need to shift its balance slightly from one side to the other. Gravity does part of the work. The ropes provide direction. Human coordination controls the rhythm, and the statue moves forward. It is not magic. It is physics, but physics alone does not explain how the technique could have been developed. Someone had to understand it. Someone had to teach it. A group of workers had to practice together until they could move the statue safely. And if the statue tilted too far, the consequences could be catastrophic. A falling Moai could injure or kill workers and potentially damage the monument beyond repair. The transportation of these figures was therefore not simply a matter of brute strength. It required technique. It required discipline. It required communication. It required a team. This is one reason the walking theory is so fascinating. It changes our perception of ancient Rapa Nui technology. The people did not need a machine that looked like a modern machine. Their technology could exist as a method, a tradition, and a form of collective knowledge. The machine was the coordinated group of people itself. The ropes were the interface. The Moai's shape provided the mechanical advantage. And the road became the working surface. But did the ancient Rapa Nui actually use this method? The evidence is suggestive but not absolute. Experimental archaeology can demonstrate that something is physically possible. It cannot automatically prove that the same technique was used in the past. Archaeologists therefore look at multiple lines of evidence. They study the shape of the statues. They examine ancient roads. They investigate where fallen Moai were found. They consider oral traditions and later historical accounts. And they compare the physical requirements of different transportation methods. One particularly intriguing clue is the shape of some of the ancient roads associated with the movement of the Moai. Certain routes appear relatively wide and curved, which could potentially accommodate an upright statue being rocked from side to side. If a statue were being dragged horizontally, the road might have been designed differently. But again, interpretation is difficult. Roads can have multiple purposes, and archaeological evidence rarely provides a single obvious answer. Another clue comes from the statues themselves. Some Moai have bases and proportions that may have made upright movement more manageable. Researchers have suggested that the ancient builders may have deliberately shaped the statues to facilitate transportation. If so, then the Moai's form was not purely artistic. It may also have been engineering. The shape of the statue could have influenced how it was carved, how it was balanced, and how it was transported. Art and engineering were not separate disciplines. They were part of the same process. But there is something even more fascinating about the walking theory. It fits with a traditional idea preserved in later Rapa Nui oral history, that the Moai walked to their destinations. We must be cautious here. Oral traditions were recorded after European contact, and they cannot be treated as a direct technical manual from the ancient period. Stories can change. Meanings can evolve. But when a cultural tradition describing walking statues appears alongside a physically plausible transportation method, the combination is intriguing. Perhaps the language of walking preserved a memory of how the statues were actually moved. Or perhaps it was simply a symbolic description of their journey. We cannot know for certain, but it gives the mystery another dimension. Imagine the scene if the walking method was used. A massive stone ancestor stands upright on an ancient road. Ropes extend from its body. Groups of workers stand on both sides. The command is given. One side pulls. The statue tilts. Another group pulls. The figure rocks back. Again. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it begins to advance. Dust rises beneath its base. The ropes tighten. Workers shout to maintain rhythm. And then the impossible happens. The stone giant moves, not because it has come alive, not because of some lost machine, but because dozens of human beings have learned how to control its balance. The statue moves forward another step, then another, and another. For the people watching, the sight must have been extraordinary. Perhaps it really did look as though their ancestor was walking toward them. Eventually, the Moai would reach its destination. But transportation was not the final challenge. The statue still had to be raised onto the ahu. This required another carefully controlled engineering process. The builders may have used ramps, ropes, levers, and other techniques to raise the enormous figure into an upright position. Once standing, the Moai could dominate the ceremonial landscape, and then another stone element might be added. Some of the largest statues received enormous red stone cylinders known as pukeo. These were carved from red scoria at a separate quarry called punapau. Somehow, these heavy stones also had to be transported and raised onto the heads of the Moai. So the engineering challenge did not end when the statue arrived. The builders still had to complete the monument. The entire process reveals something important about Rapa Nui society. Moving a Moai was not an individual accomplishment. It was collective. It required large groups of people working toward a shared goal. That means the transportation process itself may have reinforced social bonds. People did not simply build monuments together. They learned how to cooperate through monumental construction. The statue became a symbol not only of an ancestor but of the community's ability to organize itself. A successful Moai project demonstrated that a group could mobilize labor, solve engineering problems, and create something that would survive for generations. But this also raises a difficult question. If the Moai required so much labor, why did the tradition eventually decline? Why did the quarry fall silent? Why did the construction of these monumental statues stop? Was it because resources became scarce? Was it because the social system that supported the monuments changed? Did religious beliefs evolve? Did political competition become less important? Or did environmental pressures make the old system increasingly difficult to maintain? The transportation mystery, therefore, leads directly into a much larger question. It is not only about how the statues moved. It is about the society that was capable of moving them. Because to move a stone giant, you need more than ropes. You need people who are willing to pull together. You need leaders who can organize them. You need food to support the workers. You need tools. You need roads. You need knowledge. You need a reason to believe the effort is worth it. The Moai are therefore evidence of social organization on a remarkable scale. They tell us that Rapa Nui society was capable of collective action over generations. And perhaps that is the real engineering achievement hidden behind the statues. The stones are impressive, but the human coordination required to move them may be even more impressive. Today, we can reproduce some of these techniques using modern replicas, cameras, measurements, and scientific analysis. But the ancient builders had none of those advantages. They learned through experience. They passed knowledge from one generation to another. They made mistakes. They adapted. And eventually, they developed methods capable of moving stones that modern people once assumed were impossible to transport without advanced machinery. The mystery of the Moai, therefore, may not be a story about a lost technology. It may be a story about forgotten knowledge. Knowledge of balance, knowledge of stone, knowledge of ropes, knowledge of terrain, and above all, knowledge of cooperation. But the journey of the Moai leaves us with one final question. If these enormous figures could be moved across the island, why did the people build them in the first place? Why were their faces positioned toward the communities? Why did some receive enormous red stones on their heads? And why did this extraordinary tradition eventually come to an end? The answers take us beyond engineering and into the most difficult chapter of Rapa Nui history. Because the same island that produced the stone giants eventually faced dramatic environmental and social changes. For generations, the Moai had represented ancestral power. But eventually, the world around them began to change. The forests declined. Resources became more difficult to manage. Religious traditions evolved. Political structures shifted. And the monumental tradition that had dominated the island for centuries began to fade. The question is no longer simply how the Moai moved. The question becomes much darker. What happened to the people who built them? For centuries, the story of Easter Island was told as a warning. A small civilization arrived in the middle of the Pacific, built hundreds of enormous stone statues, cut down its forests, exhausted its resources, fought over what remained, and eventually destroyed itself. It was a powerful story because it seemed to contain a lesson that modern society could easily understand. A civilization had everything it needed, but through greed, competition, and poor decisions, it consumed its own environment. The forests disappeared. The society collapsed. The Moai were abandoned. And the island became a monument to human self-destruction. But the real history of Rapa Nui is far more complicated. The people did not simply vanish. Their descendants survived. Their culture survived. Their language survived. and archaeological evidence suggests that the collapse was not a single dramatic event caused by one mistake. Instead, the island experienced centuries of environmental, social, cultural, and eventually external changes that transformed Rapa Nui society. To understand what happened, we first have to look at the forest. When the first Polynesian settlers arrived, Rapa Nui supported a more extensive palm-dominated forest ecosystem than the largely open landscape we see today. One of the most important trees was the giant Rapa Nui palm, known scientifically as Pascalococcus disperta. Its remains have been identified through pollen, seeds, wood fragments, and other archaeological evidence. The forest provided resources that could be used for food, construction, fuel, tools, and other purposes. But forests on a small, isolated island are fragile. Once trees are removed, there may be no neighboring forest from which the ecosystem can recover. The island had no large continental landmass nearby to replenish its biological resources. Everything had to come from the island itself or from the surrounding ocean. Over generations, the forest declined. The reasons were probably multiple. People cut trees for fuel and construction. Land was cleared for agriculture. Trees may have been used for boats and other technologies. And there was another unexpected participant in the process: the Polynesian rat. Rats are believed to have arrived with the first Polynesian settlers, intentionally or accidentally, and archaeological evidence suggests they consumed palm nuts. If rats prevented new palm trees from regenerating, they could have accelerated the decline of the forest. The result was a complex interaction between humans, animals, vegetation, climate, and land use. The old story of simple overconsumption therefore begins to break apart. The people were certainly changing their environment, but they were not necessarily unaware of what was happening, and they did not simply continue behaving in exactly the same way until everything disappeared. Human societies adapt. When resources change, people change with them. And evidence from Rapa Nui suggests that the islanders developed strategies for surviving in an increasingly challenging environment. One of the most important was agricultural adaptation. Without extensive forest cover, the islanders had to protect their crops from wind, moisture loss, and changing soil conditions. They developed techniques such as rock gardening and the use of stone mulch. Rocks could help protect the soil, reduce evaporation, and moderate temperatures around crops. In some areas, agricultural systems became highly adapted to the island's difficult environment. This is an important part of the story because it challenges the idea that environmental decline automatically means social collapse. A society can lose resources and still adapt, can change its technology, can change its diet, can reorganize its labor, can modify its agricultural practices. The disappearance of the forest was therefore not necessarily the end of Rapa Nui civilization, but it did change the conditions under which that civilization operated. The world that had supported the earliest generations was becoming a different world. Wood became harder to obtain. Large trees became scarce. The construction of certain types of boats became more difficult. The availability of wild resources changed. And eventually, the monumental tradition itself began to decline. The quarry at Rano Raraku, once filled with the activity of stoneworkers, became increasingly quiet. Hundreds of unfinished Moai remained behind. The reason is still debated. It may have involved changes in political organization, religious beliefs, labor demands, environmental pressures, or several factors at once. What we should not imagine is a single day when everyone stopped carving and abandoned the quarry. The archaeological record suggests a gradual transformation rather than a simple switch being turned off. The meaning of the Moai tradition may also have changed. The statues had been closely associated with ancestors, communities, status, and religious authority. But societies do not preserve their institutions forever. Beliefs evolve. Political systems change. New forms of religious expression can replace older ones. And on Rapa Nui, one of the most dramatic transformations was the emergence of the Birdman, or Tangata Manu, tradition. At the ceremonial village of Rongorongo, high above the cliffs of Rano Kau, a new ritual system developed around a competition connected with the annual migration of the Sooty Tern. The competition was dangerous. Competitors or representatives would descend the cliffs, cross the waters to the offshore islet of Motu Nui, obtain the first sooty turn egg of the season, and return with it. The individual whose representative successfully returned with the egg could secure the title of Tangata Manu, or Birdman, for his patron or group. The exact details and chronology of the tradition are complex, but its significance is clear. The religious and political landscape of Rapa Nui had changed. The islanders were no longer expressing power primarily through the creation of ever larger stone ancestors. A new form of competition had emerged. Instead of demonstrating influence through monumental stone construction, power could be connected to ritual achievement and the control of a sacred title. The dramatic cliffs of Orongo became a new center of ceremonial life. Looking at the landscape today, it is difficult to imagine how dangerous the competition could have been. The cliffs fall toward the Pacific. The offshore islets rise from the sea below. The participants had to descend, swim, climb, and return under dangerous conditions. Yet the danger itself may have been part of the ritual's meaning. It transformed physical courage into political and spiritual authority. This shift is important because it suggests that Rapa Nui society was not simply collapsing after the forests disappeared. It was changing. The people were creating new systems of meaning. They were adapting their institutions to a new environment and a new social reality. But then another force arrived from beyond the island. In 1722, a European expedition led by Dutch navigator Jacob Roggeveen reached Rapa Nui on Easter Sunday, giving the island the European name by which it became widely known. The encounter marked the beginning of a new and devastating chapter. The islanders had already experienced centuries of environmental and social change, but European contact introduced threats that were fundamentally different. Disease could spread through populations with no previous exposure to particular pathogens. New animals and goods entered the island's ecosystem and society. Religious and political pressures followed. And over the 19th century, the population suffered catastrophic losses through disease, violence, and especially the kidnapping and enslavement of islanders. These events are essential because they challenge the idea that the Rapa Nui population simply collapsed because of its own actions. External forces played a devastating role. In the 19th century, slave raiding operations carried away large numbers of Rapa Nui people. Leaders, workers, and members of the community were taken from their homeland and forced into labor elsewhere. Epidemic disease followed, further reducing the population. The social consequences were enormous. Oral traditions were disrupted. Knowledge systems were damaged. Religious institutions were transformed. Families were separated. And much of the cultural context that might have explained the ancient monuments disappeared with the people who carried that knowledge. This creates one of the deepest mysteries surrounding Easter Island. The stones survived better than the stories. The Moai remained standing, but the society that had created them was dramatically transformed. When later outsiders looked at the island, they saw the monuments but did not necessarily understand the cultural world that had produced them. This gap created fertile ground for speculation. Outsiders began asking whether the people who built the Moai had been technologically advanced, whether they had mysteriously disappeared, or whether some unknown civilization had helped them. But the real history is more human and, in many ways, more tragic. The people of Rapa Nui did not disappear into thin air. They endured extraordinary changes. Their ancestors had crossed the Pacific and established a community on one of the most isolated islands on Earth. Their descendants adapted to environmental change. They transformed their agricultural systems. They developed new religious traditions. And then they were confronted by the outside world in ways they could not control. The old image of a civilization committing ecological suicide, therefore, needs to be treated carefully. There is strong evidence that human activity contributed to the transformation of the island's environment, including deforestation. But the idea of a simple, sudden ecocidal collapse is increasingly inadequate as a complete explanation. Some researchers have argued that the population may have adapted surprisingly well to the island's changing conditions. The disappearance of the forest did not automatically mean the disappearance of society. People continued farming. Communities continued living on the island. Cultural practices continued to evolve. The catastrophic demographic collapse came later, especially after European contact. This does not mean the environment was irrelevant. Quite the opposite. Environmental change likely placed enormous pressure on Rapa Nui society and forced people to adapt. But environmental pressure and social collapse are not the same thing. A civilization can survive profound environmental change while becoming culturally different. This distinction is crucial. The end of the great Moai building tradition does not necessarily mean the end of Rapa Nui civilization. It may instead represent the end of one particular way of organizing society. The stone giants had dominated the landscape for centuries. They had expressed ancestral authority. They had required massive collective projects. But eventually, the society that had created them found other ways to express power, identity, and religious belief. The island was not empty. The people were not gone. The culture was changing, and this may be one of the most important lessons hidden within the ruins of Easter Island. Civilizations do not always end in a single dramatic collapse. Sometimes they transform. Sometimes old institutions disappear while new ones emerge. Sometimes environmental changes force adaptation rather than extinction. And sometimes the greatest catastrophe comes not from nature or internal conflict, but from forces arriving from outside. Yet even after centuries of research, one question remains unsettling. If the Rapa Nui people were capable of adapting to environmental changes and reorganizing their society, why were so many Moai left unfinished? Why did the quarry fall silent? Why did the great tradition of monumental construction disappear? Perhaps the answer is not that the people suddenly lost the ability to carve stone. Perhaps they no longer had the same reason to do it. The world had changed. Their beliefs had changed. Their priorities had changed. And the meaning of the Moai may have changed with them. Today, the unfinished statues at Rano Raraku can look like evidence of a civilization interrupted by disaster. But they may represent something more subtle. They may be evidence of cultural transformation. The people stopped investing the same resources in the old monumental system because a different world was emerging around them. And that possibility makes the unfinished Moai even more haunting. They are not necessarily monuments to failure. They may be monuments to change. But there is still one final mystery. Even after the forests declined, even after the great statues stopped being carved, and even after the religious system evolved, the people of Rapa Nui continued to preserve knowledge and traditions. Somewhere within that culture may have existed explanations for their history that we can no longer fully recover. One of the most mysterious examples is a collection of wooden tablets and objects covered in strange symbols. They are known as Rongorongo. Their meaning remains uncertain. Are they writing? Are they mnemonic devices? Are they genealogical records? Religious texts, or something else entirely? And if these symbols could be understood, what might they tell us about the people who created the Moai? Could they reveal the names of ancestors? Could they explain the rituals? Could they describe the journeys of the first settlers? Could they preserve memories of a world that disappeared? We do not know. And that brings us to the final stage of the mystery. Because the story of Rapa Nui is not only about stone giants, vanished forests, or an isolated civilization. It is also about knowledge that has been lost. There are questions we can answer through archaeology. There are others we can approach through experimental science. And then there are questions for which the evidence remains frustratingly incomplete. Who exactly did each Moai represent? What did every symbol mean? How precisely were the largest statues transported? What did the ancient ceremonies look like? And what stories did the Rapa Nui themselves tell about their origins? The stones can give us clues. The landscape can give us clues. Genetics, archaeology, ecology, and experimental research can give us clues. But the people who lived through those centuries are no longer here to explain their world in their own words. The island has kept the monuments. Time has taken much of the context away, and perhaps that is why the mystery of Easter Island has survived for so long. We are looking at the remains of a society that was isolated enough to develop something extraordinary, yet connected enough to participate in the wider human history of the Pacific. Their story was not a simple rise and fall. It was a story of exploration, adaptation, ambition, environmental change, cultural transformation, and devastating outside contact. And the Moai are the silent witnesses to all of it. They stood while forests disappeared. They stood while generations changed. They stood while new religions emerged. They stood when European ships arrived. And they remain standing today. But there is still one final question we have not answered. If the Rapa Nui people created the Moai to preserve the power and memory of their ancestors, what else did they leave behind? What knowledge was written into symbols that we can no longer read? What connections existed between Rapa Nui and the wider Pacific? Did their navigators ever reach the coast of South America? And could the surviving evidence reveal a chapter of Polynesian exploration that history once overlooked? The answers may be hidden in the final mysteries of the island. Because after everything we have seen, the greatest mystery may not be how the Moai were built or why they were abandoned. The greatest mystery may be what the people of Rapa Nui knew, and what we have forgotten. The Moai still stand. The volcanic quarry still exists. The ancient roads still cross the island. The ceremonial platforms remain scattered along the coastline. And beneath the grass, soil, and stone, archaeologists continue to uncover fragments of a civilization that once seemed almost impossible to understand. We now know far more about Rapa Nui than people did a century ago. We know that its first settlers were Polynesian navigators who crossed enormous distances across the Pacific. We know that the island developed a distinctive culture with complex social and religious traditions. We know that its people carved hundreds of monumental stone figures and developed ingenious ways of moving them. We know that the island's environment changed dramatically over time. And we know that European contact brought disease, violence, enslavement, and demographic catastrophe. But despite all of this knowledge, the island continues to hold mysteries that archaeology cannot completely solve. Some questions may eventually be answered by new discoveries. Others may remain uncertain forever. And perhaps the most frustrating mystery is that the people who knew the answers are no longer here to tell us. One of the most intriguing mysteries is known as Rongorongo. On a small number of surviving wooden tablets and objects, strange symbols were carved into the surface. Lines of figures, geometric shapes, human-like forms, animals, plants, and other symbols appear to have been arranged in sequences. To modern eyes, they look like writing. But what exactly were they? For generations, researchers have tried to determine whether Rongorongo represents a true writing system. If it does, it could be one of the most extraordinary achievements in the history of the Pacific. If it does not, it could instead represent a sophisticated mnemonic system designed to help trained specialists remember chants, genealogies, rituals, or other information. The problem is that only a small number of authentic objects survive, and the original cultural context has been severely disrupted. We do not possess a bilingual inscription like the Rosetta Stone that would allow us to compare Rongorongo with a known language. We do not have a surviving ancient dictionary. We do not have a living community of traditional specialists who can explain every symbol. And many of the people who might once have understood the system were lost during the devastating population decline of the 19th century. Imagine discovering an ancient library after nearly everyone who could read it had disappeared. The books remain, but the language is gone. You can recognize patterns. You can identify repeated symbols. You can compare sequences. But understanding the meaning of an individual sign can remain extraordinarily difficult. That is the problem facing Rongorongo researchers. And if Rongorongo were ever fully deciphered, the consequences could be enormous. It might reveal names, genealogies, religious traditions, historical events, or information about the island's rulers and ancestors. It could potentially provide a voice from a society that left behind almost no conventional written historical record. But until the system is convincingly deciphered, the symbols remain silent. Then there is another question that has fascinated researchers for generations. Did the people of Rapa Nui ever reach South America? The distance between Polynesia and the South American mainland is enormous. At first, the idea might seem unlikely, but Polynesian navigators had already demonstrated the ability to cross vast stretches of the Pacific. They reached islands spread across an enormous geographic area, from the western Pacific to the eastern edge of Polynesia. Rapa Nui itself represents one of the furthest eastern outposts of Polynesian settlement. So could Polynesian voyagers have continued even farther and reached the South American coast? The question became especially interesting because of the sweet potato. The plant originated in the Americas but became widespread across Polynesia before European exploration. How did it travel across the Pacific? For a long time, the origin of the sweet potato in Polynesia was one of the strongest clues suggesting ancient contact between Polynesians and South Americans. Genetic studies have added further complexity to the debate, with evidence indicating prehistoric contact between Polynesian populations and indigenous peoples of South America. The timing, location, direction, and exact circumstances of those contacts remain subjects of ongoing research. But the broader possibility is extraordinary. It means that the Pacific may not have been a barrier separating two worlds. It may have been a highway connecting them. Polynesian navigators were capable of deliberately exploring enormous distances, and the ocean may have carried people, plants, genes, ideas, and technologies between distant societies long before European ships entered the Pacific. If contact occurred, it would change the way we imagine ancient Pacific history. Instead of isolated island communities existing independently from the rest of the world, we would see a network of ocean-going societies capable of extraordinary long-distance interaction. Rapa Nui would then become not an isolated dead end, but part of a much larger story of human exploration. But there is another theory that refuses to disappear, a theory that has become famous through books, television programs, documentaries, and popular culture. The idea that the Moai may have been created with the assistance of beings from beyond Earth. The argument usually begins with the same observation that has fascinated people for centuries. These statues are enormous, and the island seems too small and too remote to support the construction of such monuments. How could ancient people have done it? Some claim that the precision of the statues, their size, and their transportation are evidence of advanced technology that ancient humans did not possess. Perhaps, they argue, extraterrestrial visitors provided the knowledge. Perhaps the Moai were constructed using technology that has since disappeared. Perhaps the statues themselves are evidence of contact with an advanced civilization from another world. It is an entertaining idea. It is also one of the most famous modern interpretations of Easter Island. But there is a major problem. We do not need extraterrestrial technology to explain the archaeological evidence. Human beings have repeatedly demonstrated the ability to accomplish extraordinary engineering feats using simple tools, careful planning, experimentation, and coordinated labor. The pyramids of Egypt, the monumental architecture of Mesoamerica, the stone circles of prehistoric Europe, and countless other ancient structures show that impressive construction does not automatically require advanced machinery. The Moai are extraordinary, but extraordinary does not mean impossible. Archaeological experiments have demonstrated that large replicas can be carved using stone tools and that upright statues can be moved using ropes and coordinated teams. The ancient Rapa Nui did not need cranes from another planet. They needed knowledge, and perhaps that is actually more impressive, because the true achievement was not some mysterious technology that appeared from nowhere. It was the development of practical knowledge within the culture itself. Generation after generation learned how to work volcanic stone. They learned how much pressure a rope could withstand. They learned how a statue's center of gravity affected its movement. They learned how to organize teams. They learned which paths could support heavy loads. They learned how to coordinate dozens of people into a single mechanical system. That knowledge was technology. It simply did not look like modern technology. Yet even after we reject the need for aliens, the island remains mysterious. There are still questions about exactly how the largest Moai were transported. There are questions about the precise organization of labor. There are questions about the political relationships between different communities. There are questions about the religious meaning of individual statues. And there are questions about what happened during the transition away from monumental statue building. Archaeology rarely gives us perfect answers. Instead, it gives us probabilities, patterns, and evidence. A road can tell us that something moved through an area. A fallen statue can tell us where a transportation attempt may have failed. A quarry can reveal how stone was extracted. Soil can reveal changes in vegetation. Pollen can reveal vanished forests. Human remains can reveal diet and disease. Genetic evidence can reveal ancient connections between populations. But none of these things can completely reconstruct a human life. They cannot tell us exactly what a Rapa Nui mother thought as she watched her son leave for a dangerous voyage. They cannot tell us what a stoneworker felt when the face of a Moai finally emerged from the mountain. They cannot tell us what people believed when they stood beneath the enormous stone ancestors at sunset. And they cannot tell us what the ancient builders thought the future would look like. This is where the mystery becomes deeply human. We often ask how the Moai were built because the engineering seems impossible. But perhaps we should also ask why people throughout history build monuments at all. Human beings have always attempted to make temporary lives permanent. We build tombs for the dead. We carve names into stone. We raise monuments to rulers. We construct temples for gods. We create memorials so that people we have lost will not disappear completely. The Moai belong to this much larger human tradition. They were enormous because memory itself was important. Their scale may have expressed the power of ancestors, the status of communities, or the importance of maintaining a connection between generations. They transformed the landscape into a physical record of identity. And unlike a written book, a Moai did not need to be read, could simply be seen. The face of an ancestor could stand above the village for generations. That may explain why the statues continue to affect people today. We do not know the names of most of the individuals they represented. We do not know the exact stories attached to each monument. Yet when we look at a Moai, we immediately recognize something human. A face, a body, posture, presence. The stone is ancient, but the emotion it evokes is familiar. Perhaps that is why the Moai have survived not only physically but culturally. They became symbols of mystery because we can recognize ourselves in them while knowing almost nothing about the people who carved them. And then there is the final question. What happened to the knowledge? The ancient Rapa Nui possessed a complex understanding of navigation, agriculture, stoneworking, social organization, and ritual. Some of that knowledge survived through oral traditions and cultural continuity. Some was transformed over time. Some was lost. The arrival of Europeans accelerated that loss through disease, slavery, population decline, and cultural disruption. The result is a strange archaeological paradox. We have hundreds of giant stone monuments, but only fragments of the intellectual world that created them. We have the physical evidence of extraordinary achievements, but incomplete explanations for the beliefs behind them. We have the stones, but not all the stories. And perhaps this is the real mystery of Easter Island. It is not that the people were somehow incapable of creating what we see. It is that we have forgotten enough of their world to make their achievements appear supernatural. When we lose context, ordinary human intelligence can look like magic. When knowledge disappears, engineering can look like impossible technology. When traditions are interrupted, monuments can become puzzles. And when written explanations are gone, we begin filling the silence with our own theories. Aliens, lost civilizations, secret technologies, forgotten continents. But the archaeological record points toward something both less fantastical and more remarkable. Human beings did this. Polynesian navigators crossed an immense ocean and found a remote island. Their descendants built a society there. They adapted to an isolated environment. They developed unique agricultural techniques. They carved nearly 1,000 monumental figures. They transported stones weighing many tons. They built ceremonial platforms. They created new religious traditions when their society changed. They survived environmental pressures. And then they endured devastating encounters with the outside world. Their story is not the story of a mysterious civilization that suddenly vanished. It is the story of real people facing real challenges over many generations. The Moai are not evidence that ancient humans were less capable than we are. They are evidence that human capability has always been greater than we sometimes imagine. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden beneath the mystery. We do not need to invent an unknown civilization to explain the achievements of Rapa Nui. We need to take the achievements of Rapa Nui seriously. We need to understand that sophisticated knowledge can exist without modern machines, that engineering can be built from observation and experience, that navigation can be mastered without GPS, that communities can coordinate enormous projects without computers, and that a small society can leave behind a legacy large enough to capture the imagination of the entire world. The Moai have stood for centuries. They have watched the landscape change around them. They have survived the decline of the forests, the transformation of religious traditions, the arrival of European ships, and the dramatic population losses that followed. They have watched generations disappear while the stone remained. Today, tourists stand before them with cameras. Scientists study them with instruments. Archaeologists map the roads and quarries. Historians reconstruct the fragments of the past. And millions of people around the world continue to ask the same question. How did they do it? But perhaps we should ask another question. Why did they do it? Because the answer to that question may tell us more about the people of Rapa Nui than any measurement of stone ever could. They built the Moai because ancestors mattered. They built them because identity mattered. They built them because memory mattered. And perhaps they believed that as long as the ancestors remained standing, a connection between the past and the living would never be completely broken. The statues were designed to outlast individual human lives. And they succeeded. The people who carved them are gone. The society that raised them has changed beyond recognition. The ceremonies have transformed. The ancient forests have largely disappeared. The quarry is silent, but the faces remain. Silent, massive, human, still looking across the island. And perhaps this is why Easter Island continues to feel so mysterious. Because the island does not give us a complete answer. It gives us fragments, a face carved in stone, a road leading nowhere, an unfinished giant sleeping inside a volcano, a wooden tablet covered in symbols we cannot fully read, a ceremonial village overlooking the Pacific, a distant genetic connection across thousands of miles of ocean, and countless questions buried beneath the landscape. The mystery survives because the evidence survives. But so does something else. The memory of a people who crossed one of the greatest oceans on Earth, found a tiny island at the edge of Polynesia, and transformed its volcanic stone into monuments that would survive them by centuries. They did not leave behind skyscrapers. They did not leave behind machines. They did not leave behind an empire stretching across continents. They left behind faces, faces carved into stone, faces that have watched over Rapa Nui for generations. And perhaps, after all these centuries, the most extraordinary thing about the Moai is not that they still stand. It is that they still make us ask questions. Because every unanswered question reminds us that history is never completely finished. There are always fragments waiting to be discovered. There are always stories hidden beneath the soil. There are always mysteries inside the stones. And somewhere beneath the silence of Rapa Nui, there may still be answers waiting for us. Until then, the Moai will continue to stand, as they have for centuries, silent witnesses to one of humanity's most extraordinary journeys. Across the Pacific, across generations, and across time, this is Easter Island, this is Rapa Nui, and this is the mystery of the stone giants.